What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of.
Stand up.
Yeah, Vicki Robinson from last night, the end of last night's Hangout. I love it so much and just thought it'd be a great way to start. She sang that to all of us when we were wrapping it up. And so good, as was all of last night's Hangout, by the very special guest joining me today. For the first time, Dr. Jemar Tisby is here, and I am wildly impressed by him and his work and his ability to communicate it. This is a real great guest, and I am so excited to have you listen to this conversation and introduce him to you for the first time if you've not heard of him before, and look forward to having him back. It is Thursday, but we did the Hangout last night. If you missed it, you missed out. So good. 3 hours, I think, that we spent together, and it was really awesome. But as a result, I usually am not able to do the news segment, and today is no exception, the day after the Hangout. So I'm just going to get right to it. Stop making excuses. Just get right to it, Pete, because this conversation is so good and nobody cares, and why am I always perseverating over it? If I have time, I always want to get into the news. If I don't, I want to get this up. And that is what I chose to do today on our way up to my parents' house in Syracuse, and just had to get this done and posted in between the Hangout and leaving, which is tough to do. So yeah, it's like the middle of the night. But nonetheless, I think this is absolutely worth it. Jemar is the author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Color of Compromise, the truth about the church's complicity and racism, and How to Fight Racism. His latest book is How to Fight Racism, Young Readers Edition, which we talk a little bit about. He's been the co-host of the Pass the Mic podcast since its inception 7 years ago. His writing has been featured in Washington Post, Atlantic, New York Times, among others. He's a regular commentator on outlets like NPR, CNN's New Day he's been on, and he speaks nationwide on the topics of racial justice, U.S. history, and Christianity. Earned his Ph.D. in history and studied race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century, and you can follow him in his work through his newsletter, Footnotes, and on social media at Jemar Tisby. Definitely subscribe to his Substack, jamartisby.substack.com, and that's it. Let's do it. Finally here, I've just told them all about you. First time, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me.
Oh, of course. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad we can make it happen.
Yeah, man. Let's get to know you a little bit. Yeah, interesting life, interesting bio. How you came to this work. Of course, you yourself were not religious apparently growing up. So when did you kind of discover, and how did you discover religion? What was your family like?
Yeah, we weren't hostile to religion. It just wasn't high on the radar. As a matter of fact, I mean, it was sort of saturated and infused in different ways. So I went to a Catholic school, kindergarten through 8th grade. That I don't think had a huge deal to do with the fact that it was Catholic, but more so with the fact that the principal of the school was our next door neighbor. And my mom got to know her, trusted her, and ended up there. But also it was one of these things where religion was sort of seen as, one of the boxes you check to kind of be a good person. And so my parents had me baptized at the age of 8 at the church that was literally across the street from us. But there was no real follow up or anything like that. I didn't really start getting into religion until high school.
What happened there?
It was I was a sucker. It was a classic friendship evangelism. You could write a textbook on how I became a Christian. There was this dude in my freshman health class that started at some ungodly hour. I swear it was before 8 a.m. And then we had a unit on swimming where we had to go swimming, and we were the first ones in the pool. The advantage was it was cleaner. The disadvantage was it was freezing cold. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. It's just what I remember. And this guy, his name is Christopher. We called him Toph for short. He just befriended me, and he kind of stuck out in high school. Like, he didn't cuss, he didn't use swear words, and he would get like really worked up about not cheating and making sure he had integrity. I'm like, what is with this dude? He's taking life way more seriously than the rest of us. He was a Christian. And then eventually, as we became friends, he invited me to his youth group, which was a white evangelical church, ministry. And for folks who are familiar, this would have been mid 90s. And so it's like right in the height of like the seeker sensitive movement. Willow Creek Church, Saddleback, and Rick Warren, and all those folks. So they did evangelism really well. Like, the youth group happened on Wednesday night, and it was just, they had everything a high schooler would want. They had food, they had sports, they had girls, and like I said, I was a sucker. So, but you had these 15-minute sermonettes. And I don't know, they kind of made sense. And I will say, I had a great youth pastor. Most youth pastors are like these super young guys. It's their first sort of professional ministry, and it's a stair step to a senior pastor role. This guy, his name was Dave, had been a youth minister probably for 20 years by the time he got to me. And so he actually really knew what he was talking about and conveyed religion in a really persuasive way. And they cornered me one day on a youth retreat. I remember, I think it was a winter retreat because we were in a cabin and it smelled like wet socks, just a typical guy cabin. And they were like, all right, you heard the message, you heard the gospel. Are you in or you out? And I sat there and I prayed the sinner's prayer, and boom, I'm a Christian.
Wow, that is some story. But I mean, I think that, it's not the most original way to arrive. This is what happens. I mean, you get recruited. You're definitely recruited. But what is, I think, probably more unique is that you're a black kid and you're getting recruited to a white church. And the irony of it all is that much of your work now is to be critical of that very same institution and a lot of those probably same people and communities that brought you in. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely. And it's taken me years to unpack this. And the reality is sort of counterintuitive. When I was in high school and first getting involved in, the youth group, and then you start going to the church out of which the youth group sprung. And I'm always one of the only black kids or people of color in the room. But what I realized just recently is it wasn't, my work now for racial justice doesn't necessarily only arise out of a negative experience. The reality is this youth group in high school was really my first sustained experience of community and friendship. And it was a lot of my desire to pursue racial justice comes out of a desire to have that positive experience again, and even expand it, because to the degree that it wasn't a positive experience, it was pretty much due to race. And here's the wrinkle that I think a lot of white evangelicals will resonate with, but may sound a little bit different or unexpected to folks outside of it. It wasn't that I experienced overt racism. There was nobody in these circles that's calling me the N-word and saying, we don't want you on our team because you're black, or anything like that. The way racism typically evinces itself among polite company, including high schoolers, is you just don't talk about it. It's never a topic. It's never a consideration. It's never a concern, which what that meant was my reality wasn't a concern, because at this point, I'm a teenager, and black teenagers, we're already getting it, namely from the police. And so I remember my friend group was mostly black folks and Spanish speakers. And we would go
to the
movies. This is north of Chicago, Waukegan, Illinois. And so we would go to the movies, the arcade, wherever. We'd get followed around. We would get harassed. I got pulled over in high school, I don't know how many times. So I'm experiencing this reality, right? And dating is a big deal because it's all these white girls and I'm black. And like they hadn't entered their rebellious phase yet. I think they were waiting till college or something.
You were like, let's get it going here. Time to rebel.
It wasn't happening. Not that I had much game. So it wasn't all on them. I was a late bloomer in that sense.
It wasn't helping the cause.
Not at all. Not at all. But it's just so subtle. It's just so subtle. And I'm a teenager. I don't know what's going on, right? But if I could go back and talk to my younger self, I'd be like, hey, it doesn't have to be this overt, direct, malicious thing. The reality is these spaces and even the ways they're theologizing, communicating religion, you're not on the radar for them. Right. And that has reasons. Like that's not by accident. Somewhere along the line, this is where history comes in. It was intentional that you don't learn from, you don't glean from, you don't communicate about Black folks. And I just had to sit there and absorb it and wondering what was going on and vacillating between invisible and hypervisible in these spaces. And it was a lot, man. It was a lot.
I just changed what my, responses to what you're saying there just in that last moment there. Cause I'm thinking that type of attitude where they ignore it, they don't talk about it, it's not there. What you're saying, that's now you're making me think very overt, because now they're literally saying in a number of states, we're not going to talk about it. Get those books out of here. Yeah. I don't want any books where white kids are going to feel bad about a bad white man, because we don't want anybody to feel bad, apparently, or to have emotions of any sort, or to empathy. But like it's over now, they're trying to erase history. It's a different kind of ignoring what's happening and not understanding your experience. Now it's we're going to pretend that experience isn't happening, never happened. What do you have?
100%.
What do you want to say about this strategy that is really caught fire very quickly, I think?
So I think historically speaking, like my theory is evangelicals had a racial reconciliation moment, which lasted a couple decades. I mean, you're talking early 90s to probably early 2010s, where it was really celebrated in Christian circles to have multi-ethnic churches, Black pastors on staff, mostly in the music or assistant pastor, whatever. But, it was seen as progress, right? I think a lot happened. The election of Barack Obama as the first Black president brought out a lot of feelings. That's when you get the rise of the Tea Party, which has morphed into this white Christian nationalist movement we see now. You also have the murder of Trayvon Martin, the rise of Black Lives Matter in 2014, 2015. Trump announces his presidency or his candidacy in summer of 2015. And so we got a year and a half of dealing with him whittling down 24 Republican candidates to him. And then so what Trump did was give people permission to say the quiet part out loud. And I say that advisedly to communicate that the quiet part never went away. It was just during this evangelical racial reconciliation moment, it was seen as in poor taste, at least in public. But then when they saw Trump and his cronies saying what they said and getting away with it, we need to talk about accountability. But I think that's when a fringe element, understand this is 10, 15% of the total, just go bonkers. But it was another 30% or so who just didn't do anything about it. So that's what the silence today looks like. It's complicity.
Yeah. And also that's true of the rest of us too. Complicity and not doing anything about it, especially, the liberal whites is who I like to talk to and about like, it's terrible what they're doing to Black people. I got to go. Yeah. Oh God, it's absolutely, I feel horrible. I got to give them a couple bucks.
I am late for Whole Foods.
I have got to get to the paddleball. I feel like pickleball is still fairly white, but I don't know. Pickleball seems like.
I think it is, but Jamie Foxx is like big into it.
Oh yeah, well he's aging. It sounds about right for him and his back.
Jamie, we love you.
Yeah, we love you, Jamie. Of course. I mean, he's a huge fan of the show. Never misses an episode. Talk to me about the way that you see things now, specifically in the kind of, well, you can define these terms if you want, what you just refer to as Christian nationalism and why you see them as such a threat, or how much of a threat, how do you see them as a threat?
Oh my goodness. So what I always
I'll give you the next 6 hours.
In the next 6 hours. That's what we would need to get started. That would be our primer. I mean, in a nutshell, what I typically say is that white Christian nationalism is the greatest threat to democracy and the witness of the church in the United States today. I think people can see this if you know what to look for.
I'm sorry. What is that? That was a religious thing. What does that mean? It's a threat to the witness of the church.
Yeah. So I was going to start with democracy, but I'll start with the church. Let's get into it. So why are people leaving the church? Why are people running away from Christianity? It's not because folks are embracing the poor or marginalized or the prisoner. They're running away because of the Marjorie Taylor Greens of the world, of the Jerry Falwell Juniors of the world, because of the governor of Tennessee refusing to support common sense gun laws, right? That's what's driving people away from the church. And so it's so ironic that to evangelize, and the root word evangelical and the evangel is about sharing the good news to invite other people into a relationship with Jesus and into the church. But evangelicals, who, it should be said, not all evangelicals are white Christian nationalists, but evangelicals are uniquely prone to being white Christian nationalists.
Right.
And the point I'm trying to make is, even though the name means to invite people in and to share the good news, what they're doing in terms of a public witness is bringing shame to the name of Jesus and pushing people away in droves. So that's why I say it's the greatest threat to the witness of the church. If you want people in the church, and I don't just mean a building on Sunday morning, but as part of the people of God, a part of this community, then you're going about it the complete opposite way that would actually appeal to people. And I don't just mean like appeal to them in a marketing way. I mean, actually appealing to their humanity and their dignity, right? So that's what I mean.
No, that's I appreciate that explanation on the witness point. And I'll ask you about the democracy point. But yeah, I mean, whenever I think about this, I'm not religious. I was raised Catholic and did all that. But whenever I think that Jesus that I know, I'm no expert on scripture, but I feel like if he came back, he'd be like, I didn't say that. I don't want you to do that. No, don't do that. That's bad. Like there's in no point did I ever demonstrate that I ever role model that behavior. And I definitely didn't. I don't love AR-15s. I think he'd probably say that too. I don't know. I don't want to speak for him.
Swords into plowshares, something around that.
But
you nailed a very important theological point. So a lot of the critique.
Well, it was an accident.
Hey, we theologize all the time and we don't even realize it. You were profound just there. I get a lot of critique when I talk about white Christian nationalism because I talk about it mainly as a historian or from my personal experience. And they're like, there's not enough Bible. Evangelicals are always like, you're not sufficiently Christian. And they'll find a lot of different ways to say that. For me, it's when I talk about these things, even when I talk about history, there's not enough Bible. So then I'm like, okay, well, y'all don't know. I am a master of divinity. That's what the degree says. I got a master of divinity from seminary. So if you want to go there, I have that gear. So here's the thing. It's a violation, white Christian nationalism, of the first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. It's certainly a violation of the second commandment. But the one that I focus on is the third commandment, which says you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Jemar, why are you focusing on the third commandment and white Christian nationalism? Doesn't the third commandment just mean we shouldn't cuss? Doesn't the third commandment just mean we shouldn't say Jesus Christ as an expletive? No, that's the lowest, form of application of that commandment. What it really means is don't do things in the name of God that God would never condone. And that's what white Christian nationalism fundamentally does, is that it says there are no restrictions on gun ownership. It says that there's only a certain type of immigrant, and we don't want the other ones from shithole countries. It says that only certain people have a right to bodily autonomy. It says that only certain people should vote. It is a complete contradiction in so many ways of what Jesus was talking about in Matthew 25. Whatsoever you do for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you've done to me. And that's why I say white Christian nationalism is a violation of the third commandment, because they are doing things or not doing things, and they're saying it has the divine approval of God.
And
got a problem with that.
In talking to Kristen Demez in her great book, Jesus and John Wayne, and of course, Robbie Jones, you're on this panel with them a few weeks back in DC. It's uniquely American, this Christian nationalism, because those two words don't have the, any reference to a nation, in specific nation, and similar beliefs and communities. I mean, it's happening in Europe, obviously, we can talk about it. And it's happened obviously in history, but this uniquely American brand includes this degree of really super masculinity, and then you throw the guns in there, and that's what really seems to make this brand uniquely American. What would you say is different now and this time in our country than anywhere else now or in the past?
So there's certainly sort of religious nationalism writ large, and kind of any organized religion is going to have its very authoritarian, rigid, narrow stream. So it has expressions globally, but in the United States, it has taken on, a uniquely American flavor. A lot of it has to do with the myth that we tell ourselves about the history of this country. And it goes by many names, American exceptionalism being one. But basically this idea that the nation was founded as a Christian nation, and that we prosper or we fall in a conjunction or concert with how well we politically as a nation stick to biblical principles. Of course, that's narrowly defined by white Christian nationalists, and there's many other expressions of Christianity that would be different, but that's what they say. And the uniquely American flavor, it has to do with that story. It also has to do with race. And so a lot of people, including myself sometimes, will say simply Christian nationalism. I say it because it's one syllable shorter, but we should always remember the white in white Christian nationalism. The way that the U.S. perfected a social, political, and economic hierarchy based on this construction that we call race, that put people considered white at the top, people considered black at the bottom, and all the gradations in between. So those elements, this almost lost cause version of American history, and this specifically racial, in particular, white supremacist, anti-black form of racism is what gives the United States its unique spice on this white Christian nationalism thing.
You do have a way with words. Why do they hate? Why do white Christian evangelicals have such issue with black folks? And then they would say, going back to your story, well, I don't have any problem with black folks. I'm really good friends with Jemar. But
that's it. That's it.
But racism, and you could just comment on this too, is I think there's many ways to discuss it and define it, but the real impactful issue is when it's systemic. So when there are policies that limit opportunity for healthcare, education, and employment, voting access, that's way worse than being mean to someone or calling someone a name. So talk to me about why they specifically have such issue and why systemically it matters so much, because they have a lot of the power. They're certainly very influential on laws.
Pete, you've been doing your homework, man. Listen, if there's one misunderstanding, piece of misinformation I could correct in this whole race conversation, it would be the difference between individual and attitudinal racism and systemic and institutional racism, right? So you ask, like, what? Why do white evangelicals have such a problem? It's because Emerson and Smith talk about this in their book, Divided by Faith. Classic, not very long. Everyone should read it. And they're exploring, as sociologists, why is 11 o'clock a.m. on Sunday morning the most segregated hour in America, right? And one of the things they talk about is the quote, evangelical toolkit, which what it boils down to is their cultural and theological tools are highly individualistic. So as sociologists, they put these things in studies and polls, and what they found is, okay, Westerners in general are far more individualistic than the rest of the world, right? But then when you look at white evangelicals as a group, they're even more individualistic. And so how does that relate to race and racism? Well, and theology. So there's a lot of emphasis on the personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And it goes to the idea of just me and my Bible. It's very anti-institutional, anti-authority. So they tend to push back against certain institutions. There's also this idea of very personal sin. There's little idea of corporate sin, but individual sin, yes, which means I'm the only one responsible for my actions. I'm not responsible for what anyone else at any other time did, which is where you get a lot of white people pushing back on the idea of something like reparations. Well, I never owned slaves. No, but you benefited from a system that categorized you as white and probably benefited your family in terms of wealth. And if they didn't have wealth in the 19th century, they had access to the means of gaining wealth throughout the 20th century and Jim Crow, because they could get jobs, they could get promotions, they could serve in certain units in the military, right? Like my uncle couldn't be a pilot. He was Black. He had all the skills, all the qualifications, right? But even if you were dirt poor, and you joined up the military, race wouldn't be an obstacle. That's why you get a J.D. Vance.
Well, I mean, the best probably example, the most impactful example of a generation, at least, I always think is you're a Black man, you saved up a bunch of money, you did everything right to buy a house, but you could not get a loan. And if you can't get a loan, you can't buy a house. And if you don't buy a house, you can't hand that to your kids. Like, so many generations of America. I just feel the home ownership one is like the one that least, it's not as sexy to talk about, but probably the most impactful thing that creates generational wealth for any human being in any country. Oh, my parents gave us this house.
Yeah, we just inherited this house, or they built another house on their property, right? Like I see that all the time too. Or they sold the house and they gave us the money, And that's just one example, right? Because if you can get into certain schools, then you can earn more, but also your children have a better chance of getting in through legacy admissions. It works itself out in all kinds of ways, but in the sort of white evangelical mind, there's really blinders on to those historical realities. So all of that to say, it's not the reason why they say I don't have a racist bone in my body is because individually they feel they're polite to Black people.
They are, people of color. And they mostly probably are.
Yeah, exactly. And that's fine. I don't want you to be mean. But your being nice to me doesn't do anything about the racial wealth gap, about home ownership, about the fact that Black women die in maternity-related deaths at 3 times the rate of white people, about the fact that Black people are 13% of the population, but almost 40% of the incarcerated population, right? Like, these are massive disparities.
The white people are using way more drugs.
Right.
And doing way less time. I think is the title of Michelle Alexander's book. White people doing more drugs, but a whole lot less time. And you could go on and on and on about it. But
there's a million examples.
The one more example, I mean, I just want you to react to this because I've never quite put it this way, but as you're talking, I'm just thinking about it. It's like, do you have kids?
Yeah.
I have 2 daughters. What do you have?
I have 1 son.
Okay. So it's like, what would you rather? Well, my white daughter, I don't want my white daughter to date your black son. Okay. And you'd be like, well, that's fucked up. But yeah, whatever. That's messed up, but whatever. That is not nearly as bad as me saying that I'm going to stand in the way of your son's scholarship or bank
100%.
loan or any other opportunity. That's the systemic thing. You can deal with my racism that's on an individual basis because that you can deal with. Okay, I'm not trying to change you, but don't take my vote. Don't take something from me.
Yes.
That's the systemic stuff, and that's the fight and what's always been the fight. And I think that's what the confusion is around what we're talking about. Well, I'm not racist. I love Jemar. His son is great. And yeah, well, I probably wouldn't let my daughter date him. But listen, he's great, another way. I don't know, but pick up on that anyway that you want to talk about how that illustrates. In my opinion, that's the way that we need to see it better.
It is absolutely that way. And then the rebuttal is, well, there's no one there like with this twirly mustache, going, ha, 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 I'm going to block Jemar's son from getting a loan, right? So they'll say, well, that's not happening either. Here's the thing. It was set up a certain way a long time ago. And all you have to do is let the system operate as it was intended. And then you actually don't need individual actors, even within institutions, even making the policies, to have malicious intent. All they have to do is not interrupt the status quo.
Well,
and that's what's happening.
I agree with you, but there is, I don't know about the mustache. I mean, it could be a lady with no facial hair. There are 2 examples that I can think of right now where government is making it harder to be black, if you are black. And that is gutting the Voting Rights Act and striking down affirmative action. So it's going to be harder for you to get into a college and catch up to the historical inequities. And now it's obviously the vote is everything. So if they're making it harder to vote, more likely to, be committed a felon and then you lose your rights. And Florida, we just talked to Desmond Meade here. I mean, like that, those are not, there's no conspiracy. That's straight up systemic policy that makes it harder to be black. I mean, do you disagree with that?
Absolutely. Yeah, no. So firstly, there are a lot of people who wouldn't look at it that way and therefore would say, well, it's not happening even systemically because there's no one individual who's purposely trying to make laws to make or policies. So this goes beyond politics, right? You can talk about economics. You can talk about the corporate world. You can talk about education. You can talk about a lot of different areas. So this is what they would say, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
They would, again, try to reduce it down to an individual and say, show me the person who says, I don't like black people, therefore. It has to be that explicit, that blatant for a lot of people.
It's all day, every day, on video and audio. Often it's a sheriff. Like, okay, I keep a log of it. It's a weird, sick hobby I have of categorizing overt. Like, he doesn't get any more racist than this. So I mean, both types exist, and often people are in power that believe and have those views, and obviously law enforcement, but in the private sector, for goodness sake.
Oh, it's so crucial. It is so crucial. So number one, this is not new. There's always deflection and denial. There's always gaslighting. That's why we have to study. We have to have the facts. We have to have the data. And it's not even to try to persuade people. It's so that we can say to ourselves, no, I'm not wrong about this. Like, all of these folks are saying it's not racism. Like, wait a minute, but wait a minute. There's this, and this. So it's partly for our own sanity that we need to have this information, right? But it's also gotten worse. It's gotten worse in the past 10 years or so.
To me, the best way to illustrate how much worse it's gotten is all that public polling, including some of which is done by PRRI, that has white people on the record, a majority of us, saying that we are more discriminated against and more persecuted against, which is true in like 2 of 100 situations I've been in.
Right.
And they were
that's
all black people who were doing it to me, and it was a comedy stage, and they didn't much care for some of my material. No, I'm saying, like, to me, that illustrates where we're at better than anything, that the actual point of view is that they have it harder. There's more discrimination against white people, especially going back to white evangelicals, because of what they believe. That, to me, is the stat that is the most discouraging, pernicious, dangerous. That's where we're at. That's what's changed, I feel.
That's definitely a big part of it. And with white Christian nationalism, you always have to have an enemy, and you always have to have a sense of aggrievement, a sense of persecution, right? So they have many different enemies. You just name it. Right now, the big one on the radar is trans people, LGBTQI community in general. But it's always, anti-black. It's always very patriarchal, all of that stuff. So you have to create an enemy other to close ranks and to say it's us against them, whoever them is. The other thing you have to say is they are ruining our way of life, taking our rights, taking our opportunities, and make yourself the victim. And that's always going to be those two messages. We got an enemy and we are aggrieved, are always going to be part of the white Christian nationalist playbook. And it's never factually based, right? It's always inflated to create a sense, to create a mythology and to build a culture, an anti-democratic, authoritarian, fear-mongering culture. But that's always there.
Yeah, and it's central to the core belief, because they believe that they are being persecuted, that their beliefs are being persecuted. And it's wild, because they actually believe that they are more limited and discriminated against than black folks. And when I think about that, I have a very hard time imagining how black people who are paying attention or ever heard that argument wouldn't just, depending on your maturity level, have an emotional reaction that would be so disheartening for them. Like, how do you possibly see that and understand that when we're sitting here going, you have no idea what it's like. We're being persecuted. Our way of life is being persecuted by these.
Yeah. Here's the thing. I mean, Pete, you're good enough. You could probably make it into a good joke, because that's about as serious as it could be. But I mean, here's the thing. Things are changing. They call it the quote unquote browning of America, right? Like, there's more black and brown folks than there were 50, 60 years ago.
You said things are changing.
Yeah, some things are changing.
Yeah, of course.
But that doesn't mean, A, the change is bad, or B, that change is oppressing you. There's that quote that floats around. I don't know who originally said it, but it's when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression.
Right. Yeah. It's the key.
And so, I think that's what's happening in a lot of cases. But here's the thing. 2 things. One, what's unique about this era is social media and in general, the digital age, and the speed at which ideas can spread. So these aren't just pockets that remain in somebody's house or at the dinner table. any racist, bigot, fringe, whoever can spout off at the mouth and go viral. So the spread of these ideas is mind-boggling. And that's how we get so much change so fast. The other thing is we're in these information bubbles. And especially for people on the far right, they have fewer outlets that they go to.
Yes, right.
And so they never cross-tabulate the information to see what's true. So you get deeper and deeper and deeper. And then the algorithms come into play. You click on one YouTube video and all of a sudden you've joined the NRA, right? Like it's that intelligent as far as what pops up on your screen. So those two things, I think, make it even harder to combat misinformation, to try to persuade anyone. I'm not really in that business, but I know white folks have a lot of these folks in their families, so you might have to deal with it. It makes it much, much harder because of this digital information environment that we're in as well.
I feel like the best thing we can do, the whites, is teach our kids, role model, and teach our kids. You wrote a book, the Young Readers Edition of How to Fight Racism, and one for adults too. But what is your advice to the whites who have kids, who, you know, have kids around them? Well, what are the things that we can do or maybe not do?
Treat race like you treat sex, or how you want to treat it, right? Which is to say, any adult knows that eventually kids get older, they're going to get curious about sex. And they're going to learn about it one way or another. And the only real question is, are you going to let them learn about it from all these other sources? Or do you want to be their first educator on this very important topic? And how do you want to go about doing it? We always talk in terms of, quote unquote, the talk. I hope it's not one talk, the talk. I hope it's the talks, or a talk that we're having right now, because it's an ongoing conversation. And when do you start? I say early and often. Just, you know, again, treating race like we should treat educating young people about sex. We have this instinct as parents to want to shield them from this kind of hate and whatnot, but we already know from scientific studies that by the age of 4 or 5, kids are absorbing racial messages about who's truly beautiful, intelligent, all those things. So the point being, they're getting exposed to it. So early is okay because it's already happening. And then often to know that there's going to be so many different situations, the landscape is changing so much, it's going to require more than one talk. It's also going to require us as adults to be educated on these things. So let me shorten this whole thing and just give you the framework that I lay out in that book, as well as the adult version of How to Fight Racism. I speak these days less in terms of specific actions to take, although those books both have practical steps. I talk in terms of this framework called the Arc of Racial Justice. That's an acronym: awareness, relationships, commitment. Or for kids, I say head, heart, hands. Mean the same thing. Awareness. We have got to study this stuff. Like, racism is dynamic. It's always changing, and it can be overt, but it can also be subtle. Yeah. And if we are not prepared, listening to podcasts like yours, reading the books, watching the documentaries, all of those things, we can be sucked in or victimized. But that's not all. We can't just have big heads about racism. We have to have big hearts around loving people well. And that's the relationships component. So for white people, y'all have spent centuries putting up walls between you and everyone else. And so you got to come out of the social gated community and get in the way of diversity. And what I mean by get in the way is it's not going to just happen. Because the way it's set up, so many white people can go through all of life and not have any real meaningful relationships with people who are very different from them. For Black people and other people of color, relationships mean solidarity. We can go further together. How can we find alliances and partnerships and coalitions to work for justice together? And then the last part, the C, the commitment or the hands. We can't just have big heads about this. We can't just have big hearts about this. We have to have strong hands to do the work that we talked about earlier before on the systemic and the institutional side. So commitment doesn't just mean staying the course. Commitment means I recognize that policies and systems and institutions, not just individuals and attitudes, are the source of racial disparities. And I'm going to figure out what to do about voting rights, what to do about incarceration, what to do about anti-Black police brutality, all of those things. So that's what I say, both to adults and to kids.
So good. Get both those books. Get all of the books, all 3 books, right? That you've written. Sir. Before I let you go, do you have time just to talk about Dr. King? I know I didn't even ask you how much time you had. We just got going here. I'm sorry.
Eat for you anything, man.
I appreciate it. I know it's getting late, but I'm loving it. And it's April 4th, as you know, and I didn't dedicate any programming here to Dr. King's assassination necessarily, but I did listen to your talk. I think it was on YouTube about, as you said at the beginning of that talk, it'd take me 8 hours to discuss his contributions. And you also made the point that sometimes people argue there's too much focus on this one man during that civil rights era. And you mentioned many of the women that deserve more focus and seemingly are starting to get their respect, sometimes posthumously, but nonetheless. And so my question is specifically about, as you talked about, and I highly recommend people go listen to the whole thing. Man, I listened to it twice today.
Oh, and you're awesome.
Yeah, there were things I got interrupted by somebody, and I didn't like that. I was walking the dog. I don't want to talk to you when I'm walking my dog, by the way. I'm out here to not talk. And then, how
you got
are
your
you?
Headphones in, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I'm listening. I was listening to you, and guys like, well, Peter, wait a sec. No,
that's poor etiquette.
Yes. So you talk about his economic beliefs, and I think it's really, really important. And you talk about his thoughts specifically on, I think this was a letter from Birmingham jail, but might have been somewhere else, capitalism. And he said in what year, 1960 something, I think, or maybe at the beginning, capitalism has failed. He said that in the 60s. I was kind of, if I had learned that before, I forgot it. And I just think that is so profound. And I think overwhelmingly right based on the condition of the planet. Start there. So thoughts, what can you share with me here at the end about, Dr. King's, if you want to, you could say anything you want about the assassination, how it's seen. I know you recently wrote about that, but also his economic theories I thought was really kind of, it's undercovered or we forget about it.
It's a crucial point you bring up. And theologically speaking, the United States is richest country in the history of the world by some estimates. And Jesus had a lot to say about money. And in 1 Timothy 6:10, I believe, it says, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. And that has a lot to do with racism because historians go back and forth about was it the chicken or the egg? Was it the racial bigotry that led to slavery? Or was it the profit motive that led to slavery and its concomitant racism, right? I lean toward the latter, where what was happening in the 1500s and 1600s in colonial United States, what became the United States, was people were trying to make money. That's why Europeans came to North America. It was to extract resources for trade. And so as they were trying to figure out, how do we farm this tobacco and this rice and this indigo and, there's cotton, how do we maximize profit and minimize loss? Well, the easiest way to do that is we don't pay our laborers and we reap all that profit for ourselves. So that's the genesis of what we now know as race-based chattel slavery. That's also the legacy of slavery is economic exploitation. And one of the things that we fail to talk about enough with Martin Luther King Jr. are his economic views, and especially toward the end of his life. Of course, he was assassinated April 4th, 1968. This is the 55th anniversary. He was in Memphis, Tennessee, for the sanitation workers' strike. 2 men had been crushed to death in the back of a garbage truck because they were not allowed to seek shelter during this massive rainstorm that short-circuited the electronics in their truck. They sought shelter in the truck and it crushed them to death. So this is why he's in Memphis, is to ally with garbage collectors, right? And this was a big part of what he saw. King really was focused on the folk, and his beloved community had a vision of not just Black folk, but any poor person having adequate resources. And in this land of plenty, no one should lack. And that's what he was focused on. So when he's talking about capitalism, he said, you know, we're so far down this road that I think some form of socialism is probably going to be necessary. Meaning there's got to be a bottom, you know, a universal basic income, universal health care, these kinds of things. His focus was on the poor. And that sounds a lot like Jesus, but it was also very controversial because you can't mess with people's guns on the right and you can't mess with their money. This is why they're doing tax breaks for who? Not the middle class, not the poor, for the rich. So when you start talking about money, you start talking about quote unquote redistribution, then you get Marxist, communist, socialist hurled at you as epithets. And that's what King was facing as well.
Yeah, and it sucks because the conversation, I think, about economics, take out race, take out history, take out a lot of these, you know, really important issues. Like we have to have a conversation about the future economy, given the fact that the founders and all the rest of economic philosophers were not counting on AI. They weren't counting on the digital age. Jobs, the face of work, all of it is going to change. We need a lot less human beings. And so we need to talk about how to create more equitable societies, you know, in a future, the future of humanity. And we get so caught up on socialism and communism and capitalism. It's like all those have failed in many different ways. We need to talk about where AI is running stuff and have a thoughtful conversation about how we're going to live our lives. And so I'm always up for that conversation. But you also said, and getting just quickly back, I really like this. I never heard it quite put this way. You said, I think these are your words, that you don't see America's original sin as slavery. You see the greed as the original sin and slavery as the symptom. Isn't that what I think I heard you say something just like that?
That's right. Yeah, that was in my first book, The Color of Compromise. Again, our sort of anemic understanding of racism says, well, there were certain white people a long time ago that really hated Black people, so they enslaved them. That's not how it went. I mean, honestly, rich white folk really couldn't care less attitudinally about Black people. What they cared about was getting rich. What they cared about was making money. And again, the easiest way to do that in a capitalist system, maximize profit, minimize loss. Your biggest line item in virtually any budget are your salaries, wages, and benefits. So you can reduce those to cut costs, or what slavery did was they eliminated them altogether, but all for the barest necessities to keep Black people productive. And that's what hardened and solidified race-based chattel slavery. And one of the things I emphasize in The Color of Compromise is it didn't have to be this way. They were flirting with indentured servitude, you know, for a couple of decades. There was certainly religious precedent not to enslave other Christians, and Black people were Christians. By the way, they didn't need Europeans. They were Christians in Africa. So it didn't have to go the way it did, but it did. And one of the questions as historians we have to ask is, why did it go the way it did? And time and time and time and time and time again, when you talk about compromise, when you talk about complicity, when you talk about racism and white supremacy, there's two factors at play, which are really two sides of the same coin. Either the threat of the loss of money or the promises of gaining more money. And that so often determines the course of events when it comes to race, justice, and equity.
So well said. And after hearing you talk throughout this almost hour, I'm feeling very bad about being white, Is there anything you can say? This is why we shouldn't talk about it. I feel very badly. What do you say? Because I have an answer that I always give. Listeners have heard it too many times. But what do you say? Not that this is your responsibility, but if you hear a white person say, listen, my kid's going to school, he's learning about all these horrible people, white people who did terrible things to black people for whatever, and it's like it's making him feel bad. What do you think about that? Again, not your responsibility to teach that. It's mine, and I'm doing the best I can. But what do you think about when you hear that
thought experiment? I mean, obviously, there's the response. Well, I hear how you care about how your kids feel. How about my black child and how they feel? Right? That's certainly valid because we tend to prioritize and center the feelings of white people to the exclusion of everyone else. But the other thing I say, if they're like Christian, there's a theological response I talk about. In 2 Corinthians 7, the Apostle Paul is writing to the church in Corinth. They've been behaving badly. And as an apostle, Paul is correcting them. And he's sort of wringing his hands and worried about how they're going to respond to this letter of correction that he had written to them previously. Well, they get that letter and they actually receive it. And they're like, okay, Paul, you're right. We're going to change. And when he gets that letter back from them, he's rejoicing. And he says, I rejoice not that I grieved you, but that you were grieved unto repentance. And so the difference I say about sort of white people feeling bad, it's not about white guilt. It's about godly grief. And so white guilt makes you feel bad. Oh, and, I've got this low melanin count and I'm responsible for all this stuff. And it's like, that doesn't do anybody any good, including white folks, but especially for black folks and others. What could be helpful is a sense of godly grief, because honestly, if you're not feeling sadness, somberness, grief over the evils that racism is responsible for, then you've got a calloused heart. There should be some level of grief, but the kind of grief that leads to change. And so that's what I say. It's like, you feel bad, cool. What are you going to do with it? But godly grief unto repentance. That's what I try to emphasize.
Love it. You were airing this on Holy Week. What does Easter mean to you? And I had I have a regular conversation with 4 black women on the show. And nice. I pretty much play the fool, but it's always a really fun, honest conversation. And so I was talking about my experience with the Easter Bunny. And I said that I went like Santa and I sat on that bunny's lap at a mall and I asked I believe I asked the bunny for gifts or whatever. And so is that do you not have a recollection of an Easter bunny in a mall? Is that because they are all making fun of me. They're like, you sat on the bunny's lap, and then it's hilarious. They're like, what did he say? I'm like, I don't remember even the gender or a conversation. I don't appreciate you genderizing the Easter bunny. But do you have is that not a thing? The Easter bunny?
No, I totally relate.
I'm older than you, but
I don't remember sitting on the bunny's lap, but it's so funny that you would mention that because literally today we were at the mall. I was at the mall with my son who's 12, and they had these signs in the mall, take a picture with the Easter bunny. And then 5 minutes later, we see the Easter bunny. It's this big 6-foot+ dude walking in an Easter bunny outfit. And I'm like, you want to take a picture? My son's like, heck no. So
it was super awkward. Santa. Super awkward when you heard from the bunny, what's up, Jemar? You're like, what?
I was like, how you know my name? I'm the Easter bunny.
With the high school. So what is okay, enough with the jokes. What is Easter? We're sitting here talking on Holy Week. You get Ramadan, you get the Passover, and of course you got the Easter, the resurrection. What do you want to say to folks, or what does that mean to you? How do you see it? How does it affect you? What role does it play in your life?
A lot of people ask me, in this racial justice work, how do you keep going? What gives you hope? There's a lot of things that give me hope, but as I think about Easter, it says that hope cannot be killed. That's what happened with Jesus. They thought they killed him, And Jesus was the hope of Israel. Jesus was the hope of the people who followed him. And when they crucified him, they thought all hope was lost. But on that third day, hope rose up out of the grave. And that tells us that in our lives, no matter how dark it gets, and I'm not pie in the sky, everything happens for a reason, just look at the bright side. I'm saying that when I think of the old folks, of the Fannie Lou Hamers, of the Martin Luther King Jr.'s who was shot and killed when he was 39 years old, of the Myrlie Evers who saw her husband killed on their front doorstep, and what kept them going, oh, there's got to be something. There's got to be something. And when I think about Easter, I think, well, maybe they were thinking that just like it looked like all hope was lost in the crucifixion and the death of Jesus, but it got up on the third day and rose again to eternal life, maybe I can go one more day. Maybe I can take one more step. Y'all, I think having hope is way harder than being pessimistic.
Oh, I like
pessimistic
that.
Doesn't take any imagination.
Yeah, I like that.
Pessimistic just says the world is crap. You know, it's just the way it's going to be. Hope says it can be different, and I can be part of the change. It's way harder to hope in the midst of everything we're seeing. And I think that God gives us Easter as a demonstration, what Jesse Jackson said, keep hope alive.
I love that. I feel like James Baldwin said something like, I'm an optimist. He was asked a question, but he's like, well, I'm an optimist because I am alive. Something like that. And I'm like, what he's saying is like, there's no other choice. And but I really like the way that you put it. About pessimism is easy. Hope is hard. Yeah. Lazy. Oh man, awesome talking to you. I thank you for an hour of your time. I'm glad we got it done. I hope you'll come back. I hope you'll come hang out with all of us. We get together, listeners, virtually.
Up to you, man. If you have me back, I'll be back. It's fun talking to you for sure.
Oh yeah, big hit. We'll get more into religion and my objections to religion, all of it. I want to talk about that. I mean, mostly focus on the threat of Christian nationalism with you today and get to know you, obviously. But there's so much more to talk about with you, and I really have loved learning from you. So I'll go plug everything again on the way out, but thank you very, very much for joining me, Jemar, and I look forward to having you back.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Dr. Jemar Tisby. First time on the show, so it would be real big deal if you went over there and told him that you heard him here on the show. Go subscribe to his Substack, JemarTisby.substack.com. Listen to his podcast, JemarTisby.com, for more on him. And that's it. That's what I've got for you today. Sorry, there was not more robust content at the beginning, but this is almost an hour-long conversation. And like I said, we had a great time at the Hangout last night. If you're not a subscriber, I would love for you to sign up right now. Go to standupwithpete.com so we can do more of this every day. All right, that's it. I'll talk to you tomorrow. Take it away, John Carroll.
I think you're driving wheels been leaking grease. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Well, there's a whole lot more of us who know what's right. They'll keep right on ignoring us if we keep sitting tight. You got to open up the window to let in some light. You got to stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. You got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. So get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. And even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Boy, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. She's the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up, stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up, they had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't even sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We gotta let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right, we got to speak up, we got to reach up and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand up.